Russia has just delivered an ultimatum to the International Monetary Fund that is shattering 70 years of Western financial control. This is not a negotiation. This is not a diplomatic protest. This is a declaration of independence from a system that has dictated terms to nations for generations. On December 18, 2024, the Russian Finance Ministry issued a formal statement rejecting all conditions attached to potential IMF engagement. But they did not stop there. Russia announced the creation of an alternative financial mechanism with 14 partner nations ready to join. What is happening behind this decision goes far beyond economics or banking regulations. This move threatens the very foundation of how Western powers have maintained dominance since the end of World War II. The dollar-based system, the debt trap mechanisms, the structural adjustment programs that have kept entire continents in economic servitude. Russia is walking away from all of it. And they are not walking alone. The question is not whether this changes the game. The question is whether the game itself still exists. But first, we need to understand how we arrived at this breaking point. To understand why this moment is so crucial, we must go back to 1944. That summer, in a small town called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, the architecture of global financial dominance was carefully constructed. The United States emerged from World War II as the only major industrial power with its factories intact. America held 70% of the world's monetary gold. The British Empire was bankrupt. Europe lay in ruins. Japan was destroyed. In that moment of maximum leverage, American negotiators designed a system that would channel global economic power through institutions they would permanently control. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were born from this conference. Now here is what you need to understand. The genius of the Bretton Woods system was its appearance of fairness. 44 nations signed the agreements. It looked like international cooperation. But the voting structure was weighted by economic contribution. The United States provided the largest share of capital. Therefore, the United States held veto power over every major decision. This was not cooperation. This was hierarchy with a friendly face. The IMF was designed to provide emergency loans to nations facing financial crisis. On paper, this sounds helpful. A country runs out of money. The IMF steps in. Stability is restored. But every loan came with conditions. Structural adjustment programs, austerity measures, privatization requirements, currency devaluation, opening markets to foreign ownership. These were not friendly suggestions. These were demands, and nations that refused faced exclusion from the global financial system entirely. For decades, this system functioned exactly as designed. When developing nations faced debt crisis, they had nowhere else to turn. The IMF became the lender of last resort. But the price of borrowing was the surrender of economic sovereignty. Argentina in 2001, Greece in 2010, Ukraine in 2014. The pattern repeated across continents and decades. Nations handed over control of their monetary policy, their fiscal policy, their strategic industries in exchange for loans that often enriched foreign creditors while impoverishing local populations. This was not aid. This was extraction with paperwork. Russia experienced this system firsthand during the 1990s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Western advisors flooded into Moscow. They promised prosperity through something called shock therapy, rapid privatization, immediate market liberalization, the dismantling of state industries overnight. The result was the greatest peacetime economic catastrophe of the 20th century. Russian GDP contracted by 40%. Life expectancy dropped by years. Oligarchs purchased state assets for pennies on the dollar, while ordinary Russians watched their life savings evaporate. The IMF provided loans totaling $22 billion to Russia during this period. But those loans came with the standard conditions: cut social spending, eliminate subsidies, open your economy to foreign ownership. The Russian people experienced this as humiliation. An entire generation of Russian leaders came to view the IMF not as a neutral financial institution, but as a weapon of Western geopolitical control. They watched the same pattern unfold in Asia during the 1997 financial crisis. They saw how the IMF demanded that Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea dismantle capital controls and accept punishing austerity while Western investors bought distressed assets at fire sale prices. The medicine always seemed to benefit creditors in New York and London, while devastating workers in Bangkok and Jakarta. Russia remembered. Russia waited, and Russia prepared. For decades, this system seemed unshakable. The dollar remained dominant. The FL maintained its position as the central authority of international crisis management. Nations that challenged this arrangement found themselves isolated and punished. But something changed. Starting in the early 2000s, a coalition of nations began quietly building alternative infrastructure. China launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The BRICS nations created the new Development Bank. Bilateral currency swap agreements multiplied. Russia and China began settling trade in rubles and yuan instead of dollars. These were not random initiatives. This was systematic preparation for a world where the IMF would no longer hold absolute power. The turning point came with the sanctions imposed after 2022, when Western nations froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. They demonstrated something profound. They showed that the international financial system could be weaponized instantly against any nation regardless of international law. Russia was not simply facing economic pressure. Russia was facing permanent exclusion from dollar-based global finance. At that moment, the calculation shifted entirely. If you are already locked out of the system, the threats lose their power. If your reserves can be frozen regardless of any rules, then the promise of access becomes meaningless. Russia began preparing for complete financial autonomy. Now, in late 2024, that preparation has reached its culmination. Let us examine exactly what happened. On December 18th, Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov held a press conference in Moscow. He was flanked by representatives from the central banks of China, India, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. The symbolism was deliberate and unmistakable. This was not a unilateral Russian decision. This was a coordinated announcement by major economies representing billions of people. Siluanov read a prepared statement with 3 key points. First, Russia would no longer participate in any IMF programs under current governance structure. Second, Russia would no longer recognize IMF assessments of its economy as legitimate. Third, Russia was launching something called the Eurasian Stability Mechanism, a new institution designed to provide emergency financial support without Western involvement. The financial commitments behind this new system are substantial. This is not symbolic posturing. This is real money. China has pledged $50 billion in initial capital. India committed $20 billion. Russia itself will contribute $30 billion. Smaller partners including Iran, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and several Central Asian nations are adding another $40 billion combined. The total initial capitalization reaches $140 billion. For comparison, the IMF has total lending capacity of roughly $1 trillion. The Eurasian Stability Mechanism starts at 14% of that figure. But here's a crucial difference. Unlike the IMF, this new mechanism does not require approval from Western nations to deploy its funds. Decisions can be made quickly by the members. For the members, the terms of lending under this new system represent a fundamental departure from IMF orthodoxy. Under the IMF model, a country in crisis must agree to privatize state enterprises, cut social spending, open capital markets to foreign investors, and accept oversight of domestic economic policy. Under the Eurasian Stability Mechanism, none of these conditions apply. Borrowing nations will face no requirements to privatize, no demands to cut pensions or health care, no mandates to let foreign corporations purchase national assets. Instead, the conditions focus on productive investment, infrastructure development, and regional trade integration. A nation facing a balance of payments crisis could access emergency funds by committing to build transportation links connecting to Chinese Belt and Road corridors, or by increasing energy trade priced in local currencies rather than dollars. The emphasis shifts from austerity to development. This is a completely different philosophy of crisis management. What traditional media is not reporting is the level of coordination that preceded this announcement. This was not improvised. This was years in the making. Russian officials have been meeting with Chinese, Indian, and Middle Eastern counterparts for over 18 months. The technical architecture of the new settlement system has been in development since early 2023. Chinese technology firms provided the blockchain infrastructure for currency clearing. Indian financial institutions contributed expertise in rupee internationalization. Iranian experience evading sanctions informed the design of transaction routing systems. The coordination extends to resource commitments that mainstream analysts are missing entirely. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have quietly agreed to accept payment for oil exports in currencies other than dollars when trading with Eurasian Stability Mechanism members. This is staggering. The petrodollar system has underpinned American financial dominance since the 1970s. It is now being deliberately undermined by some of its original architects. These are not rogue states. These are major oil exporters who have been American partners for decades. Their willingness to participate signals a profound shift in how they view their strategic interests. There is also a domestic political dimension within Russia that Western analysts consistently ignore. President Putin faces election cycles, though the outcomes are not in doubt. He needs to demonstrate strength. Rejecting the IMF plays extremely well with a Russian public that has been skeptical of Western financial institutions since the catastrophic 90s. But beyond politics, this reflects a genuine strategic calculation. Russian leadership has concluded that any future conflict with NATO will involve economic warfare from the outset. By normalizing separation from Western financial systems during peacetime, Moscow is conditioning both its population and its institutions for scenarios where that separation becomes total. This is not a bluff, this is preparation. The response from Western institutions reveals their concern. The IMF released a bland statement expressing disappointment and reiterating its commitment to all member nations. But privately, officials are alarmed. If the Eurasian Stability Mechanism succeeds, it could trigger a cascade of defections. Nations in Latin America that have suffered under IMF austerity will suddenly have leverage. African countries tired of structural adjustment demands will have options. Southeast Asian economies that remember 1997 will see alternatives. Countries can now threaten to take their business elsewhere. This undermines the IMF's ability to impose terms. And if the IMF cannot impose terms, its fundamental purpose as an instrument of Western economic statecraft evaporates. American officials are even more concerned about reserve currency implications. The dollar's status as global reserve currency allows the United States to run enormous deficits without consequences other nations would face. Foreign central banks hold trillions in dollar assets. This creates permanent demand for dollars and allows the Treasury to borrow at artificially low rates. But if international trade increasingly settles in alternative currencies, demand for dollars declines. Treasury yields rise. The cost of financing American debt increases dramatically. The entire economic model that allows the United States to maintain global military presence while running chronic deficits comes under pressure. At this point, I need to step back from the immediate events and look at this through a realist lens. International politics is not about morality or rules. It is about power. States act to maximize their security and influence. When a dominant power like the United States establishes institutions that benefit itself, other states comply only as long as they lack alternatives. The moment alternatives emerge, rational actors pursue them. For decades, Russia lacked the capability to challenge American financial dominance. The economy was recovering from Soviet collapse. The military was rebuilding. Political institutions were stabilizing. In that context, accepting disadvantageous terms was rational. Russia had no options. But by 2024, the calculation shifted entirely. Russia has rebuilt its military capabilities. It has accumulated financial reserves despite sanctions. It has secured long-term energy contracts with China and India. Most importantly, it has partners willing to join an alternative system. When a state's relative power increases, it seeks to renegotiate or exit arrangements made during periods of weakness. This is not ideology. This is not about democracy versus autocracy. This is about the timeless dynamics of power. This framework also explains why China is supporting Russia's move despite the risks. China's economy now roughly equals America's in purchasing power terms. China runs massive trade surpluses. China holds over $3 trillion in foreign reserves. Yet China still operates within a financial system where ultimate authority rests with institutions China does not control. This is an intolerable situation for any great power with alternatives. By backing the Eurasian Stability Mechanism, China is diversifying away from dependence on Western financial architecture. If the mechanism fails, China's losses are manageable. If it succeeds, China gains influence over a parallel system where its weight matches its economic power. The logic is structural, not personal. If different leaders were in power in Moscow or Beijing, but the distribution of capabilities remained the same, similar dynamics would unfold. When the international system is hierarchical, and some states gain power to challenge that hierarchy, they will do so. The only question is timing and form. The strong do what they can. The weak suffer what they must. This ancient observation from Thucydides still captures the essence of international politics. For decades, the United States was so dominant that challenging its financial system seemed impossible. Nations suffered the conditions because they had no choice. Now, a coalition of states representing half the world's population believes it has a choice. Russia's rejection of the IMF is the predictable response of a major power that no longer benefits from the status quo and has accumulated sufficient capability to challenge it. The consequences will affect every American and every person connected to the global economy. If the dollar loses significant reserve currency status, Americans will face higher interest rates and reduced purchasing power. The easy money that has funded American consumption for decades becomes more expensive. Inflation becomes structurally higher. The trade deficit must shrink, meaning fewer imported goods. This is what the end of financial hegemony looks like from the inside. For nations across Eurasia, this move creates both opportunities and dangers. Opportunity comes from reduced dependence on Western finance. Countries can access capital without surrendering sovereignty. Infrastructure investment could accelerate without austerity conditions attached. But danger comes from being caught between competing systems. Nations that try to maintain ties to both Western and Eurasian financial architectures may find themselves squeezed from both sides. In the next 5 to 10 years, we will see accelerating fragmentation of the global economic order. One bloc centered on the United States, using the dollar, relying on institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Another bloc centered on China and Russia, using alternative currencies, relying on institutions like the Eurasian Stability Mechanism and the New Development Bank. Some nations will attempt to bridge both systems, others will commit firmly to one side. Trade will increasingly flow within blocs rather than between them. This is less efficient economically, but more secure politically. In an era where economics and geopolitics are fusing together, security concerns will override efficiency calculations. What we are witnessing is not a temporary dispute or a negotiating tactic. This is a fundamental restructuring of global economic power. The unipolar moment that began in 1991 is ending, not because the United States chose to step back, but because rising powers accumulated the capability to challenge American dominance and develop the will to use that capability. Russia's rejection of the IMF is one moment in a longer transition, but it is a significant moment. It represents the point where challenge became institutionalized. The Eurasian Stability Mechanism may ultimately succeed or fail, but the fact that it exists and that major economies are committing real resources to it signals that the Western monopoly on international finance is broken. This move marks a historical inflection point. Future historians will likely identify late 2024 as the moment when the fracture in the global financial system became irreversible. The rules written in 1944 no longer command universal respect. New rules are being written, and this time the nations holding the pen are very different from those who drafted the original agreement. Russia has made its choice. China has made its choice. A growing coalition of nations is making the same choice. The age of unquestioned Western financial dominance is ending. What comes next, whether stable multipolar order or dangerous fragmentation, will be determined by the choices made in these crucial years. The only question now is how Washington will adapt to a world where it is no longer the sole financial superpower, but merely one power among several. That adaptation will define the rest of the century. This analysis is based on public information, international relations theory, and the analytical framework of political realism. The interpretations presented are for educational and informational purposes.